There is a question you have been avoiding. It shows up late at night. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. If I keep living exactly like this, what will I become? You don't answer it. You open your phone. You distract yourself. You tell yourself you're just tired, but the question doesn't leave. It waits. You feel it when a goal doesn't hit the way it used to. When you accomplish something and the satisfaction fades too fast. When you look at your life from a distance and something feels slightly off, even though on paper it looks fine. That subtle dissonance is not random. It is structural. You were trained to believe your 20s and 30s were the main stage. Build fast. Achieve fast. Compete hard. Establish dominance early. Secure position. Prove yourself. And you did, or at least you tried. You built competence. You built income. You built a name in certain rooms. You learned how to speak with control, how to hide uncertainty, how to project certainty even when you didn't feel it. You became functional, but something inside you is no longer satisfied with functioning. Here is the part most men never admit. You don't fully know who you are outside of what you built. Strip away the job title. Strip away the social role. Strip away the expectations attached to you. What remains? Silence. That silence is not peace. It is unfamiliarity. You optimized for survival in the external world. Status calibration. Social positioning. Avoiding humiliation. Avoiding irrelevance. Avoiding invisibility. But you never stopped long enough to ask whether the identity you built was chosen or absorbed. There is a difference. One creates direction. The other creates performance. And performance has a shelf life. You can feel when it starts to expire. Conversations become repetitive. Success becomes mechanical. Even pleasure feels processed instead of real. You are not depressed. You are not broken. You are outgrowing an identity that once protected you. That is more dangerous. Because when protection expires, most men panic. They interpret the discomfort as decline. They chase stimulation. They chase younger energy, new projects, new environments, new validation sources. They try to revive the old version, but the old version is not meant to be revived. Carl Jung understood something that destabilizes the ego. The first half of life is construction. Necessary construction. You build a persona that can operate in society. You learn the rules. You accumulate experience. You adapt. But construction is not completion. And here's the part that should unsettle you. If you mistake construction for completion, you will defend a structure that is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. Look at your recent frustration, your impatience, the low tolerance for superficial conversations, the quiet urge to withdraw and reassess. This is not weakness. This is transition pressure. Your mind is beginning to question the blueprint you followed without questioning it. The culture calls this a crisis, a midlife panic, an overreaction to aging. But what if the real crisis is refusing to evolve? What if staying psychologically 25 at 40 is the actual collapse? Right now you are standing in a space between two identities. The first one was built from imitation, competition, and external validation. The second one demands internal alignment, integration, and authorship. The problem is this: you cannot build the second while protecting the first, and that is why the tension feels sharp. Part of you wants stability. Part of you knows stability built on misalignment becomes decay. Here is the emotional loop you cannot ignore. If you continue reinforcing the version of yourself that earned approval, you may secure comfort, but you will slowly lose access to something more dangerous and more powerful: your real structure. And once that door closes long enough, it becomes harder to reopen. The question is not whether change is happening, it is whether you are conscious enough to participate in it. Because if you are entering the phase where life actually demands self-confrontation, then what you choose to protect right now will determine who you become in the next decade. And most men will protect the wrong thing. What you are feeling is not random dissatisfaction. It is psychological reorganization. But your ego does not interpret it that way. Your ego interprets it as threat. For years, your identity has been stabilized by external metrics: income, physical strength, sexual access, social relevance, professional authority. These were not shallow pursuits. They were developmental necessities. They built your persona, the adaptive mask that allowed you to compete, survive, and position yourself in the hierarchy. The persona is efficient. It negotiates. It performs. It calibrates behavior to earn approval and avoid humiliation. But here is the structural flaw. The persona is outward-facing. It is designed for the world's expectations, not for internal coherence. So when you approach the threshold where external progress no longer guarantees internal solidity, friction begins. This friction shows up as emotional fatigue, not burnout from effort, fatigue from misalignment. You can still perform, you can still execute, but something in you feels disconnected from the performance. You start asking quieter questions. Why does this feel repetitive? Why am I chasing goals that no longer energize me? Why does success feel thinner than it used to? This is where identity fragmentation begins. Part of you wants to continue expanding the external structure. More status, more leverage, more visible power. Another part of you wants integration, depth, meaning, psychological solidity. If you ignore the second part long enough, you create internal division. And internal division produces subtle symptoms: irritability without cause, loss of enthusiasm for environments that once stimulated you, reduced tolerance for superficial validation, increased need for solitude. This is strategic withdrawal, not weakness. Your psyche is attempting to reallocate energy inward. But here is the danger. If you misinterpret this inward pull as decline, you will attempt to overcorrect externally. You will double your output, increase stimulation, seek novelty, upgrade visible markers. That temporarily silences the discomfort, but it deepens the fragmentation, because the real issue is not insufficient achievement, it is insufficient integration. There are parts of you that were suppressed during the construction phase, traits that did not align with your competitive identity, emotions that were inefficient, doubts that threatened confidence, desires that did not fit the image. You suppressed them because they slowed you down. Now they are resurfacing, not to sabotage you, to complete you. If this level of analysis is rare where you are, subscribe. Not for motivation, for precision. Most men will never examine themselves at this depth. The fear underneath all of this is not aging. It is irrelevance. It is the possibility that you optimized for a game that no longer feels worth playing. But here is the uncomfortable truth. You are not afraid of becoming irrelevant to the world. You are afraid of becoming irrelevant to yourself. When your internal compass and your external life drift too far apart, you feel invisible inside your own existence. You move through routines efficiently. You handle responsibilities. You fulfill expectations. But internally, something feels muted. This is the early stage of what many label a crisis. It is not a crisis. It is the psyche signaling that the first architecture has reached its limit. Development in early adulthood is expansion. Prove, acquire, build. Development in midlife is differentiation. Separate what is truly yours from what was absorbed. This requires dismantling parts of your identity, and dismantling feels like loss. Loss of certainty, loss of momentum, loss of clear metrics. But without dismantling, there is no reconstruction. Most men never cross this threshold consciously. They stay externally optimized and internally fragmented. They maintain performance while slowly decaying in clarity. You are at a decision point. You can interpret this tension as exhaustion and numb it, or you can recognize it as an invitation to reorganize your internal structure. But reorganizing means confronting something you avoided during your rise, the parts of you that were never integrated. And once you begin to see those parts clearly, you will not be able to pretend they are not there. The next phase will require dismantling, and dismantling is controlled collapse. If you resist it, it becomes chaotic. If you engage it deliberately, it becomes transformation. The question is not whether you are strong enough to build. You've proven that. The question is whether you are disciplined enough to deconstruct yourself without losing your center. And that is where most men fail. The version of you that got you here will not take you further. That is the part your ego resists. You built that version through effort, through restraint, through calculated decisions. It carried you through competition, rejection, comparison, ambition. It protected you from humiliation. It earned you position. You respect it, but it is outdated, not useless, not embarrassing, outdated. There is a difference. Every identity is built for a specific terrain. In your 20s and early 30s, the terrain was expansion. Prove yourself, establish value, secure leverage. You needed aggression, you needed hunger, you needed external validation as fuel. Now the terrain is shifting, and if you keep using expansion tools in an integration phase, you will feel friction everywhere. You may notice it in your tolerance. Things that once excited you now feel repetitive. Conversations that revolve around status feel shallow. You feel less interested in broadcasting and more interested in observing. You might even feel a strange desire to pull back. Less noise, fewer people, more silence. Most men interpret this as social fatigue or stress. It is restructuring. When the old identity begins to loosen, there is a temporary collapse of certainty. The metrics that once told you who you were start losing authority. Promotions do not define you the same way. Attention does not validate you the same way. Even discipline feels different. Less about proving, more about stabilizing. This is dangerous territory because during this collapse phase, you are between identities. The old structure is weakening. The new structure is not yet solid. That in-between space creates vulnerability. If you rush to fill it with distraction, you freeze your evolution. If you rebuild too quickly without deep examination, you construct a more sophisticated mask, one that looks mature but is still externally driven. This is where many men rebuild incorrectly. They shift from chasing money to chasing spiritual aesthetics, from loud ambition to quiet superiority, from external validation to subtle moral dominance. Different mask, same mechanism. The real reconstruction requires something more uncomfortable. You must examine what you suppressed during your rise, the doubts you ignored, the emotional patterns you avoided, the traits you labeled as weakness because they did not serve competition. There are aspects of you that were exiled because they interfered with performance. Now they are returning, not to destabilize you, to demand integration. But integration feels like loss of control at first. You will question your past decisions. You will reassess relationships. You may feel distance from environments that once felt aligned. You may even feel temporary loneliness, not because you are isolated, because you are differentiating. You are separating inherited expectations from authentic direction. That separation creates psychological pressure. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see where men are going through this quietly. This transition is more widespread than you think, but most go through it in silence. Here is the unspoken risk. If you misinterpret this restructuring as failure, you will attempt to revive the old self aggressively. You will increase output, force enthusiasm, manufacture urgency. That works for a while. But internally, the split deepens. The collapse of the old identity is not dramatic, it is subtle erosion. You simply stop believing in it fully. And once belief erodes, performance becomes exhausting. The question is not whether the old version should disappear. It shouldn't. It needs refinement, not erasure. But refinement requires dismantling certain foundations. You must examine which parts of your ambition were fear-driven, which parts of your discipline were image-driven, which parts of your relationships were convenience-driven. That level of honesty destabilizes the ego, because it reveals that much of what you called drive was avoidance of invisibility. Now you are being asked to build from a different source, not fear of being nothing, but clarity of who you are. If you rebuild from fear again, the next collapse will be harsher. If you rebuild from clarity, the structure will hold. But clarity demands time in uncertainty, and uncertainty is where weak identities panic. You are currently in the gap between who you performed and who you are capable of becoming. Most men never tolerate this gap long enough to transform. They escape it. The pressure you feel right now is not punishment. It is selection. And how you respond to this collapse will determine whether the second half of your life is repetition or reinvention. The old self is loosening. The only question left is whether you have the discipline to let it. At this stage, the easiest move is to blame something. The economy, the culture, women, technology, your parents, your boss, the timing, the market, the algorithm. Blame gives temporary relief. It protects the ego from reevaluating itself, but it also freezes development. If you externalize the cause of your internal instability, you lose the ability to correct it. This is where many men convert restructuring into resentment. They feel the collapse of their old identity, and instead of examining it, they look outward for a villain. They tell themselves the game is rigged, that society changed, that loyalty disappeared, that opportunity shrank. Some of that may be partially true. It is also irrelevant, because your psychological structure does not reorganize based on fairness. It reorganizes based on responsibility. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The identity that is dissolving was built by you. Influenced, yes. Conditioned, yes. But reinforced by your own repeated decisions. The goals you chased, the image you protected, the emotions you suppressed, the conversations you avoided, the risks you postponed. No one forced those patterns into permanence. You stabilized them. That is not an accusation. It is leverage. If you built it, you can rebuild it. But rebuilding requires discipline of a different kind than you used before. Earlier discipline was external. Wake up early, train harder, work longer, outperform, outlast, necessary. Now you need internal discipline. Cognitive control. The ability to observe your thoughts without immediately identifying with them. Behavioral consistency. Acting in alignment with chosen values, not shifting moods. Emotional containment. Feeling without impulsively reacting. Processing without dramatizing. This is where victimhood quietly tries to re-enter. Victimhood is subtle in high-functioning men. It does not sound weak. It sounds justified. It sounds analytical. It sounds like strategic critique. But underneath, it says, I would be fine if circumstances were different. That sentence destroys power because it places your stability in external hands. You are not responsible for every event that shaped you. You are responsible for what you continue reinforcing. If your environment weakens you, it is your responsibility to change exposure. If your habits fragment you, it is your responsibility to redesign them. If your thoughts sabotage you, it is your responsibility to retrain them. This is not motivational language. It is structural reality. Without structure, collapse becomes decay. With structure, collapse becomes recalibration. The difference is discipline. And discipline at this stage is not about intensity. It is about precision. You must audit your inputs. What are you consuming daily? What narratives are shaping your perception of yourself? Are you feeding comparison? Are you feeding outrage? Are you feeding nostalgia for a past version of yourself? You must audit your outputs. Where is your time going? Are your actions aligned with who you claim you are becoming? Or are they reinforcing who you used to be? You must audit your emotional reactions. Where do you overreact? Where do you withdraw? Where do you become defensive? Those points mark the fragile areas of your identity. Most men want transformation without self-confrontation. It does not work. You cannot build a stable second identity on top of unexamined insecurity. If you avoid this stage, something predictable happens. Your frustration turns outward. Your patience decreases. Your standards distort. Your relationships strain. And eventually you call it a midlife crisis. But it was never a crisis. It was neglected responsibility. The old identity is dissolving because it reached its developmental ceiling. Now you must consciously design the next structure. That requires restraint. You will feel impulses to make dramatic changes, sudden exits, loud reinventions, extreme pivots. Resist impulsive reconstruction. Slow, deliberate correction is stronger than dramatic reaction. If you do not take control of this phase, entropy will. And entropy is ruthless. It turns potential into bitterness. It turns ambition into cynicism. It turns solitude into isolation. You are not a victim of this transition. You are the architect of what comes next. But architecture requires patience and standards. And if you are not willing to hold yourself accountable at this level, the collapse will not rebuild you. It will erode you. The next phase demands strategic reconstruction, not emotional reaction. And it will test whether you are serious about becoming stronger or just serious about looking strong. At the beginning, there was a question you avoided. If I keep living exactly like this, what will I become? Now you understand why it disturbed you, because you saw the trajectory, not dramatic failure, not public collapse, slow internal erosion. That erosion stops here, but not because you felt inspired, because you chose to reorganize. Strategic reconstruction begins with elimination. You eliminate identities that were built purely for approval. Not destroy them. Extract the skills. Discard the dependence. You keep the competence. You remove the need to be seen as competent. You eliminate habits that anesthetize discomfort instead of resolving it. Endless scrolling, reactive arguments, performative busyness. You do not need constant stimulation anymore. You need clarity. You eliminate environments that reward your mask but starve your depth. Some rooms were stepping stones, not destinations. If a space requires you to shrink your thinking or exaggerate your persona, it is no longer aligned with the next phase. Then you build. You build internal metrics. Instead of asking, how do I look? You ask, am I aligned? Alignment is quieter than validation, but it is more stable. You build cognitive discipline. You notice insecurity without obeying it. You notice comparison without feeding it. You interrupt narratives that reduce you to your past version. You build emotional containment, not suppression, containment. You feel anger without becoming reckless. You feel doubt without collapsing. You feel ambition without desperation. You build long-term orientation. The next decade is not about proving speed. It is about compounding solidity, depth of skill, depth of character, depth of relationships, depth of thought. This is where life actually begins. Not when you are chasing visibility, when you are operating from integration. Earlier, you were expanding outward. Now you expand inward and outward simultaneously. Your actions reflect internal coherence. Your discipline is not fueled by fear of invisibility. It is fueled by commitment to structure. and structure creates calm power. There is a noticeable difference between a man performing strength and a man who has integrated himself. Performance is loud. Integration is quiet. Performance seeks reaction. Integration does not need it. This is the shift. You stop chasing relevance and start embodying substance. You stop optimizing for attention and start optimizing for alignment. You stop asking, how do I compete? And start asking, what is worth building? This is not a soft phase. It requires endurance. You will endure temporary loneliness as you outgrow environments. You will endure misunderstanding from people attached to your old version. You will endure moments of uncertainty while your new identity stabilizes. But this endurance is clean. It is not chaotic. It is deliberate. The first half of your life built your survival structure. The second half builds your authored structure. Now the question from the beginning changes. If I keep living exactly like this, what will I become? If you continue with clarity, discipline, and responsibility, you become internally stable. Harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize, less reactive, more precise, more selective. You become dangerous in a different way, not because you dominate loudly, because you are integrated. And integrated men do not collapse under pressure the way fragmented men do. This is where life actually becomes real. Not because everything is solved, but because you are no longer hiding from yourself. If you are building this version of yourself deliberately, subscribe. Not for motivation, for continued reconstruction, and watch the next video. Because this process is not a single decision, it is a series of calibrations. The next step will sharpen where this one stabilized you. Most men will scroll, a few will build. Decide which category you belong to.